Welcome to Author Talks, everybody. My name is Roger Williams. I'm glad that you could all make it here tonight. We have a terrific show. I'm very pleased that tonight we are going to have two of the contributors to a book that has just been published called The 10 Key Campaigns of the American Revolution. I mention this book because over the next few weeks, we are going to have all of the contributors to the 10 Key Campaigns of the American Revolution. Tonight, we're going to be talking about New York and New Jersey with two of the contributors from that book. And we also are very pleased to have with us this evening the executive director of Morven Museum and Gardens, who is our partner in history. So I will be introducing our authors after we hear from Jill Berry of Morven Museum and Gardens. Jill, over to you.
Thank you, Roger. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of Morven Museum and Garden. And if you are not aware of us, we are the home of one of the guys that started it all. So we are the home of Richard Stockton, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he is in, the home is located in the heart of Princeton. We are open to the public from Wednesday to Sunday from 10 to 4, and we are open. We are practicing safe distancing and requiring masking for people that are coming into the museum. But through our permanent history galleries on the first floor, you can go all the way from the building of the house in 1758 all the way into the mid-'80s when the site was actually New Jersey's governor's mansion. So we have a lot of history walking through those walls. But the part that's most interesting to you all today is the life and time of Richard Stockton. So please, I encourage you to come visit us. The grounds, especially on a day like today, are absolutely beautiful, and the galleries are open, so come on down. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you, Jill. Why don't you tell us what the URL is, and I will post it in the chat feature.
Okay, it is morven.org. Very simple to remember.
That's excellent. So I will put that in the chat feature as we go through the show. And I will also tell you and invite all of our guests tonight to send questions to me using the chat feature. If you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little icon that says chat. If you want to ask either of our authors a question, you will use that feature. That question will come to me. The format for our show tonight is that we will have each of our authors give a 15 to 18 minute presentation, and then we will open it up for a question and answer. And as I said, those questions, you send your questions to me using chat, and then I will be the one who will be asking our authors the questions. So we are also taping the show tonight. So you will be able to tell your friends and family if they've missed the show, that they will be able to go to the past shows tab of History Author Talks and see our show this evening that we've taped this evening. So with that, I would like to again welcome you all, and I will be introducing both of our authors. First will be Larry Kidder, and second is Todd Braystead. First, we're going to hear from Larry. Larry Kidder, who served for 4 years in active duty with the United States Navy, was assigned to the U.S. Navy Research and Development Unit in Vietnam. He's a retired high school history teacher who taught for 40 years in both public and private schools. For more than 25 years, Larry has been a volunteer at local historic organizations in the central New Jersey area. And he is an interpreter, a historian, and a draft horse teamster. Full disclosure, Larry is also my partner in an organization called 10crucialdays.org. We give tours of the battles, the Washington Crossing and the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And I am also Larry's publisher. So the book you're going to be hearing from tonight is Larry's newest book that's coming up, but he is also the author of other titles, including A People Harassed and Exhausted, the story of the New Jersey Militia Regiment in the American Revolution, Crossroads of the American Revolution, the Trenton, 1774 to 1783, and 10 Crucial Days, Washington's Vision for Victory Unfolds. So this is 10 Crucial Days, Washington's Vision for Victory Unfolds, which I'm very proud of. But tonight we're going to hear from Larry's new book, which is Revolutionary Princeton, 1774 to 1783. So with that, I'm pleased now to introduce you to Larry Kidder.
Okay, thanks, Roger. See if I can, you need to enable screen sharing, Roger.
That's right, I do. Hang on 1 second here. And I will, there we go.
Okay, everybody can see what I've got there?
Not yet. Let's see. There you go.
Okay, is it up now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, as Roger said, this is my latest book, and it's part of a sort of a series about central New Jersey anyway during the Revolution. And what I always try to do is to bring history down to a human level and not just look at the big picture and not look at the people that are normally in the history books, but also what we might call ordinary people who also play a very important role in the events that take place. And that's what I've tried to do for Princeton. It's really cool that Marvin is a partner for this talk tonight, because Marvin plays a pretty good major role in the book, and the people who were at Marvin play a role in the book also. And it's a central thing in Princeton. There's no question about that for Marvin. So what you see on the screen is the cover of the book, and also a drawing of Princeton as it might have appeared during the time of the Revolution. And again, I use that drawing because I want to focus on the people of Princeton. And in the cover, which is, of course, as Roger knows and tells me all the time, it's there to sell the books and to get people interested, and people are certainly interested in the Battle of Princeton. And so you see it. But you also see in the background right here, you see the college, which you see right here in this drawing. So it's in both of them. And for those that know Princeton, this, of course, is Nassau Street. And you've got along Nassau Street all the taverns and all the shops and all the craftsmen and the people who participated in the Revolution, and also who kind of suffered at the time of the Battle of Princeton also. Now, to understand Princeton's role in the Revolution in New Jersey, it's important to know that so much took place in New Jersey. The Revolution was never absent from New Jersey, and probably more battles happened here. I think Todd would agree with me on that. That more activity happened, not only because we were fighting against British regulars, but because the people of New Jersey were fighting with each other, Loyalists and Patriots together. So there was just a lot of action. New Jersey had been two colonies originally, East and West Jersey, and then it joined together in the early 1700s. And there still was a dividing line that separated them. And there's remnants of that line that are geographically noticeable today also, including right at the edge of Princeton. There's a road called Province Line Road, which I understand is not exactly on the Province line, but it's pretty close to it. Now, this is important because what happened in Princeton is going to be affected by its location in the state. It's on the main road between New York and Pennsylvania, which means it's on the main road between the New England colonies and the Middle Atlantic and Southern colonies. So it's going to get a lot of traffic. But also, it's right on that borderline between East and West Jersey. And those two early colonies had very different cultures and even economics and that sort of thing. Princeton is going to be in many ways more like the towns in West Jersey because it's on the border there, but it's also going to have some influence from East Jersey. So all of that's going to kind of get into this Civil War setting that Princeton goes through. This map of Princeton at the time of the Revolution, and again, that's the main street, the street going right through. I don't know if you see that picture again on your screen. It's kind of cluttered on my screen, but the street that we saw before is this one right here. And it's interesting that that street separated Princeton, or divided Princeton into two counties. Part of Princeton was in Somerset County, part of it was in Middlesex County. That may not seem like a big deal, but when everything was organized during the time of the Revolution around counties, it could be very significant. For example, the militia system was county. So if you lived on one side of the street, you were in one militia regiment. If you lived on the other side, you're in a different militia regiment. It also meant that because the legislature was organized by county representatives, Princeton could have representatives from both the Middlesex part and the Somerset part, whereas other towns that weren't split by counties only got, one representative possibility. So it's going to play a major role. And in the illustration that you saw on the book cover and also in the first picture that I showed, you saw the College of New Jersey and the president of the college's house. Both of these buildings, of course, are still present today, right in downtown Princeton. And also, this blue area that I put in here is an area called Stony Brook, just to the south of Princeton. And there's a very important house on that property, which is the Thomas Clark House, which is on the Princeton battlefield at Princeton Battlefield State Park. And it represents the fact that the College of New Jersey was basically a Presbyterian organization, and Stony Brook was in many ways a Quaker community. There were some Presbyterians there, and there were some Presbyterians some Quakers among the Presbyterians in town. But it's really going to be a diverse town because of those two groups of people who came in. Now, the main story that people know about Princeton is that one day on January 3rd, 1777, at the Battle of Princeton. And what people don't often realize is just the significance of that. For example, in early December of 1776, the British, for all intents and purposes, had reconquered one of the 13 colonies that had declared independence. They basically occupied all of central New Jersey, or a big swath of central New Jersey. The way they did that was to set up a whole string of winter cantonments, and so their army was spread throughout the state. What this did was to put the New Jersey legislature kind of on hold. It disbanded. The governor disappeared from the state. Nobody knew exactly where he was. And the Loyalists felt pretty supported by the British. The Patriots felt abandoned because when Washington goes over to Pennsylvania and leaves the state in the control of the British, the Patriots say, where is this war going to? Nobody's helping us. We helped out. We tried to help defend New York, et cetera, et cetera. So this is why this is the time to try men's souls, because it looked like the revolution was just about over. As we know from the 10 crucial days, and I won't go into detail, the Battle of Princeton, the Battle of Trenton, and then the Battle of Princeton came about because Princeton really became a focal point of this winter campaign. Had more troops than were stationed at Trenton. And after the Battle of Trenton, even more troops are going to be stationed at Princeton. It's going to become the focal point. From there, Cornwallis is going to take most of those guys down to Trenton, and there's going to be a second battle at Trenton on January 2nd. And then Washington is going to make his roundabout trip overnight and attack Princeton on the morning of January 3rd to a very small, really, group of British soldiers, about 1,500, when he had over 5,000. So he's really going to outnumber them. The result is going to be, after that battle, instead of the British occupation that you had in December, now in January, the British are going to be retreating back towards New Brunswick and eastern New Jersey. The Americans are going to be going up to Morristown, and there's going to be chunks of American troops in the middle of the state now, including at Princeton. Princeton is going to be a military outpost during that winter of 1777, bringing some hope back to the Patriots in New Jersey and making the British feel, yeah, maybe this is going to go on a whole lot longer than we thought. But that battle is not the whole story, and that's what my book is really about. Yes, there's a chapter on the Battle of Princeton, in a good-sized chapter, but most of the chapters deal with other things. And particularly starting, again, within days of the Battle of Princeton, the town of Princeton is going to be set up as a military post. It primarily is going to be a stopping off point for troops coming from the south heading towards Morristown as the new Continental Army is being revitalized in January. But it's also going to deal with militia and other troops. And the people of Princeton are going to keep suffering. They had suffered under the British for almost a month before the Battle of Princeton, and a lot of pillaging and a lot of damage caused to the town by the British. But they're going to be just as unhappy having the Americans around starting in January of 77. Princeton is also going to be a military hospital for pretty much the rest of the war. Yes, they're going to use Nassau Hall, the college building. They're also going to use some other buildings in town. And this gets all started because there's casualties at the Battle of Princeton, and they're going to start using the college facilities for those men, both American and British. And then as the war continues in 1777 into the Forage Wars and then into the Philadelphia campaign, they're going to be bringing people back from Paoli, from Brandywine, from Germantown. You know, all of those battles are going to have wounded men coming back to Princeton. So Princeton is going to be continually occupied, and the college is going to be continually occupied. One of the main stories, or one of the great stories, is how the college, and remember, the college isn't like the University of Princeton today, you know, many buildings all over the place. It was essentially one building. All the students lived in one dorm. It was also the classroom building. There were maybe three other employees, including the president of the college, and it all happened in this one building. And this building became almost unusable for the college at points. And how John Witherspoon, who was the president, worked with that and was able to bring about some restoration throughout the war and keep the college going is also a major story. The town was also a supply magazine, and people in Princeton with various occupations got involved in the supply department, basically gathering supplies, purchasing supplies, and helping to get them to the Continental Army, whether it be at Morristown or Middleburg or wherever in New Jersey. And you got just a couple of names to throw out. Enos Kelsey was very much involved with getting clothing together for the Continental Army. And Jonathan Baldwin, who actually worked for the college at one point, he was the steward, the food guy for the students until he quit. And then he got really involved in the revolution politically and other ways. And he became involved as a kind of an arsenal for the Continental Army in Princeton. towards the end of the war in 1783, Princeton became home to the Continental Congress for almost 6 months. And when the war ended, the Continental Congress was at Princeton. They'd been forced from Philadelphia by unhappy Continental troops who kind of were ticked off at not getting paid and not getting a lot of other things the Continental Congress had promised them. And so the Continental Congress felt safer in Princeton than they did in Philadelphia. This was not the first time government had been in Philadelphia. The New Jersey legislature had spent a lot of time off and on during the war in Princeton also. So it was definitely a political center. We know about some of the key people, people that are well known, like Richard Stockton of Morven and John Witherspoon of the college, Jonathan Dickinson Sargent, who was another early patriot and also a member of the Continental Congress early on. The debate over independence, though, these men did not all agree on whether independence should be now or later. They each had their own viewpoint, but Richard Stockton and John Witherspoon finally came together right at the same time and were there to sign the Declaration. Certainly, there were Loyalists and Patriots both in Princeton. The Loyalists didn't fare so well. Most of them left town one way or another. One of their homes is on Nassau Street now, the Bainbridge House, which is a very interesting story about Absalom Bainbridge and his activities supporting the British in town, but also helping some of his patriot neighbors. And of course, Morven is here. And you got patriot living there. I don't have time to really tell you the story of probably the most interesting person to come into Princeton during the war and become a resident of Princeton. This was Colonel George Morgan in 1779. He had been an Indian agent out at Fort Pitt area for the Continental Congress, and he was really fed up with the way the Indians were being treated. And he eventually quit after other people who worked with him kept charging him with various crimes because they wanted him out of there so they could deal inappropriately with the Indians and get hold of their land and make a fortune. Morgan actually brought Delaware Indians back to Princeton, some young boys, and got them through the college and did a number of very interesting things. And his home was called Prospect, and there is still on the Princeton University campus today a house called Prospect, which is much newer, but it's on the site of George Morgan's house. So that's a very quick introduction, and I hope I've given you the idea that, yes, there are a lot of people that you've heard of associated with what happened in Princeton, but there's also a lot of people whose stories are not as well known, but whose stories indicate the value that everyday people played in keeping this war going and making it a 10-year thing, essentially 8 to 10-year thing, rather than just a battle here and there. It was constantly in people's lives. And with that, I will gladly turn over to Roger and then Todd, and I'm looking forward to hearing Todd.
Excellent. So I will, whoops, hang on a second.
Should I stop sharing now here?
Yeah, stop sharing, and then I need to, something's going on with my little thing here. Hang on. Okay, there we go. Excellent. Larry, I commend you. For those of you who know Larry, you'll know that he gives a great talk. I don't think he's ever done this in this short a period of time. But as his publisher, I always remind him that people can buy his book. So, but he does, you know, Larry will be also talking about his book in other longer formats, but I encourage you to take a look at Larry's work. He's gotten some great reviews for this book. So I remind you also again that if you have questions for Larry or for Todd's upcoming talk, you can use the chat feature and send the questions to me. I've also posted the link for bookshop.org, which gives you not only Todd's and Larry's books, but also some other books on New York and New Jersey during the Revolution. Now, our next guest, Todd Braystead, who is the author of Grand Forage 1778, the battleground around New York City. Larry set him up perfectly for this because, as you could see, that in 1777, or I should say at the end of 1776, New Jersey was occupied by the British. The Americans recaptured the state, retook the state, and were really in control of New Jersey and much of what we think of today as suburban New York for the rest of the war. And Todd is really going to give us a look at how the rest of the war really sort of played out in the New York area. Todd is not only the author of Grand Forage 1778, he is also the author of Bergen County Voices from the American Revolution, Soldiers and Residents in Their Own Words, and the Loyalist Corps, American Service of the King. He is a researcher for the Loyalist military studies. His primary focus is on Loyalist military personnel, infrastructure, and campaigns throughout North America. Since 1979, Todd has amassed and transcribed over 40,000 pages of Loyalist and related material from archives and private collections around the world. And he has authored numerous journal articles and books, as well as appeared as guest historian on a number of TV shows. He is a fellow of the Company of Military Historians and the past president of the Bergen County Historical Society. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to Todd Braystead.
Thank you so much, Roger. Pleasure to be here this evening, and thank you all for joining us tonight. So honored to be sharing the stage, as it were, with Larry. Hopefully, we can do it in person one day, not in the too distant future, and so we get to see everybody in person again. That's the hard part about being a speaker and not getting to see so much of your audience and their reactions and whatnot. That could be a blessing too, perhaps. But in any case, thank you for having me. Grand Forage 1778, and I'm not going to use my PowerPoint. I'm not going to try and compete with Larry's. Brevity is never my friend, so I'm not going to risk fate and go into a 40-minute PowerPoint in a third of that time. So we're going to do this old school here, and you're going to see me actually move my lips and talk. So that being said, this has to do, we're going to go back 4 years to the origins of this, when my friend Don Hagest, who is the editor of Journal of the American Revolution, approached me about my thoughts about books on lesser known campaigns of the American Revolution. Now, like Larry, I enjoy researching the common soldiers, the everyday people that did the bulk of everything in 18th century life. Certainly the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons or John Adams are fantastic people to study, but they're the minority of people in the 18th century. John Smith down the corner tilling the back 40 acres of his farm for corn. I mean, that's the guy from the American Revolution that I want to study. The private soldier in the ranks with a musket. Not the guy giving him the orders. So this is one I wanted to focus on. And I told Don that, I thought this series might be good. He asked me if I had anything in particular that I could do. I said, sure, because somebody offers you a book, you don't say no. So I said, sure. And I wanted to put together something that wasn't really a campaign, but turn it into a campaign. And that's all the little events that occurred in a specific time frame between August and October of 1778. Now, there's no great battles during this time period, all right? As Larry mentioned, the British had come into New Jersey, in 76. And by 1777, they only held a small part of it. Well, by 1778, they only held a really much smaller part of it around Paulus Hook and Sandy Hook. And that's pretty much it. The British were in Philadelphia, and then they weren't. Well, why weren't they in Philadelphia anymore? And the book then goes into what strategic things were at play that transpired into a local setting. Well, what happened in 1778? Well, first off, Sir William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, wanted to go home to England. So he was going to be replaced by his second-in-command, Sir Henry Clinton. So Lord George Germain, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for American Affairs, sends him a note saying, Sir Henry, you're the new British commander-in-chief. Go to Philadelphia, take charge, good luck. And we'll support you, do whatever you want to do, no change in strategy. Yay, Sir Henry. Well, about a week later, Germain sends another dispatch saying, you're still commander-in-chief, but we're going to dictate your strategy. And by the way, you need to lose 40% of your troops. Sorry. And while you're at it, abandon Philadelphia immediately. France had entered the war. Well, why is that a big deal? Well, without France or any other European power in the American Revolution, the Americans had no real navy. I know we have John Paul Jones, we have privateers. That's not a threat to the Royal Navy. That's a threat to merchant ships and small armed vessels, but it's no threat to big British 64, 72, 90-gun ships of the line, all right? One broadside of that, poof, no more privateer. So as long as the British controlled the seas, they could go as they pleased on the coast of America. However, now with France, by the way, had a bigger everything than the British. People think, British Army was the biggest army in the American Revolution. No. The French, the Prussians, the Austrians, the Spanish all had bigger armies than the British. So the British had to use their forces judiciously. And now with the French fleet, it put Britain's outposts at risk. All right, the islands of Jamaica, the West Indies, their far post in Nova Scotia, West Florida. Yes, there were two Floridas at the time, East and West. So those are all in danger now of the French fleet and any expeditionary force that the French may send over here. So they have to evacuate Philadelphia, get to New York, and then start sending reinforcements to these outposts and launch an attack on two places. One, the West Indies, trying to beat the French to the punch, and two, Georgia, because the war has not really come to the South that much. And in the North, it's kind of a stalemate, as we're going to see. So from that point on, the British concentrated in New York City after the Battle of Monmouth. They march across New Jersey. Battle of Monmouth takes place. It's a draw. The British would have been happy to have won, of course, but their goal was simply to get 20,000 men and God knows how many wagons and horses safely to New York City, which they pretty much accomplished. So now the French fleet arrives after the British get to New York. The British say, we're ready for them. The French leave. They go up to Rhode Island. A storm intervenes up there. There's an American-French siege of Rhode Island. That doesn't pan out. The French go away to Boston. The British are now left in New York City, planning on losing 10,000 out of 25,000 troops, right? So Henry's army of British, Loyalist, and German troops has known victory for the most part during the war. But now, with 10,000 of them gone, Sir Henry is not going to have much of an offensive force left. Washington at this point is up in Westchester. He's up at White Plains, and his force is growing minute by minute. to a force of over 20,000 men. It's the largest his force is going to be for the rest of the war at this time. And he's looking at the British making preparations with their ships. And with ships, you have to make all sorts of preparations. One, you have to water them. Not water them to grow, but put water in them for the voyages. You have to stock food and whatnot. And the Americans can see all these preparations. New York Harbor is right there. So, anybody, with eyes can see what's going on. So Washington is hopeful that the British are evacuating New York City. In his view, he's beaten them at Monmouth. Now the French are there, and he's thinking the British are going to evacuate. So he's just going to gather his forces and wave goodbye to them as they sail out of New York Harbor. Well, the British have no intention of completely evacuating New York City. So what they're going to do is sort of mess with Washington a little. In Westchester, and there's any number of small skirmishes with light infantry troops, including the Loyalist troops under such famous people as Banastre Tarleton and John Graves Simcoe. If anybody watched the old A&E series Turn, you may recall the name John Graves Simcoe. He's the person that was generally dripping blood from him. Not exactly as he was in the Revolution. He was actually a very sort of noble guy that Hollywood turned into an arch villain. But he's doing well there. And the British need supplies. So the British rely on England and Ireland to get their supplies for the most part, particularly food for the human beings. I mention human beings because that's not the only thing that eats food. An army travels on its stomach, but that means that the horses that supply the army also travel on their stomachs. Well, what do you need horses for? Well, you have wagons to pull your supplies. You have wagons to crate anything around. You have wagons to draw your artillery pieces. Most of your officers are on horses. Your cavalry, your mounted soldiers are all on horses. So the British have several thousand horses that they have to feed every day. They send oats over from England, but the oats are the smallest part of a horse's diet. A British horse, by regulation, and the British are nothing without regulations, the horses eat 14 pounds of hay per day. And according to horse friends I have, they say that's a light diet. The American horses eat more than that. So I guess a bit of a stereotype there, Americans disgorging themselves, even their horses. But the British now have 14 pounds of hay to feed every horse of theirs every day. And including hay they're going to have to put on these ships, because where the men go, they're going to take their horses with them as well. So the British need lots of supplies. The hay does not come over from England. The hay is obtained locally. And where do you grow hay? Well, you grow it in Westchester. You grow it on Long Island. You also grow it in Bergen County, New Jersey, where I am happily coming to you from right now. Sir Henry Clinton had foraged in New Jersey in September of 1777. By forage, obviously is the name of the book, we mean come in and take supplies that are needed by point of food. And while you can obtain supplies by paying for them, and the British did pay for a number of supplies, it was for those who were deemed loyalists. So if you were waving a little flag going "Yay King George," which I don't think they actually did, but the British would give you a nice receipt saying, here, cash this in and we'll give you the stipulated rate of money for your hay or corn or whatever they're taking. Now, if you were actually shooting at the British, they're not going to give you one of those. They're going to say, thank you for your hay. You did a fine job with your crop this year, Mr. Rebel, but we're going to take all your crop. So that's what the British had to do. So in September 1778, they erupt into Bergen County and into Westchester for the purpose of gathering up all this food. All the food that Bergen County has grown, that Westchester has grown, they need to feed their troops. And during this time, more actions take place. the British also send at the same time an expedition down to Egg Harbor, New Jersey. One of the things Lord George Germain has suggested to Sir Henry Clinton is that he used the Royal Navy now to move the British Army locally and raid the commerce of the Americans, i.e. the privateers. Sir Henry wanted to attack New London, Connecticut, for instance, but the tide wasn't favorable, so he couldn't get in there. So he sends 550 troops under Captain Patrick Ferguson, a brilliant Scottish officer who invents a breech-loading rifle. And he sends them down to Egg Harbor. This is where it gets a nice international flair to it. You have the Scotsmen in charge of New Jersey Loyalist troops and British regulars going to attack the militia at Egg Harbor. The privateers have all scattered. They knew the British were coming. They all set sail out to say, no more privateers. But Congress sends a regiment to defend Egg Harbor, and it's commanded by a Pole, Count Casimir Pulaski. And his men are Germans and French and Poles and you name it. They're from Europe, they're from America. What they don't know is Egg Harbor. And the locals there don't get along well with him to begin with. One thing leads to another. The British try to leave. They get unfavorable tide. So Ferguson figures, well, while I'm here, I'll go attack Pulaski. Wipes out his lieutenant colonel and his picket. One of the two major engagements of this Grand Forage. But forage comes to an end by mid-October. Ferguson gets back to New York. The troops under Cornwallis, which had been in Bergen County, come back to New York. The troops under General Kniphausen, the German officer, remove themselves from Westchester. Sir Henry Clinton has got enough food, so the expeditions are going to set sail and, do their thing where they're supposed to go. They conquer Georgia. They take St. Lucia from the French, but the war doesn't change in any appreciable way at that point. Washington never engages the British. In fact, he goes further north up to Fredericksburg and never engages with Sir Henry's main force. Sir Henry probably would have liked to get one last use of a big army, but it never happens. So lots of skirmishes, lots of food collecting. So logistics plays a huge part in this, and the grand strategy of the American Revolution played out in micro detail in the New York metropolitan area, and that's basically your book right there. Roger?
Thank you, Todd. Well done. Again, a lot of important action happening in a very short period of time, and I appreciate your giving us that overview. So we now have some questions, and again, I also invite everyone to, again, use the chat feature if you have some other questions you would like to ask. I've got a few here, and I'd like to start off asking Larry, you had given us that map of East and West Jersey. Larry, this is one of my favorite topics. Could you tell us a little bit more about the demographic makeup, especially with religion, and a little bit of the history between East Jersey and West Jersey, and what's significant about the actions in 1776? Why did Washington go all the way down to Bucks County, for example, after the disastrous New York campaign?
Okay, I'll be short, but this could be a long answer. There's a lot of differences. Well, first of all, East Jersey was basically originated with the Dutch around New York and all coming across to New Jersey. So you had a lot of Dutch reform in terms of religion, that sort of thing. And in West Jersey, you had more of a Philadelphia influence, and you had some Quakers, particularly, who had settled in South Jersey on the western side. Both sides become pretty diverse. Both are farming areas. Neither one of them is going to develop a large amount of manufacturing. That's going to be the cities, Philadelphia and New York. Those two cities are going to be ways for farm products to get out of the state, and for them and for the people in New Jersey to get items that they need for tools as well as for living and their lifestyle. I would say that one interesting thing that I've discovered since I wrote that book and some of my new research, slavery was much more common in East Jersey than it was in West Jersey. Part of that was because of the Quaker influence. The Quakers had started to talk about abolishing slavery long before the Revolution, and that continued on right through the Revolution. Whereas Presbyterians and others, Dutch Reformed, et cetera, were not as interested in abolishing slavery. So you had that. You probably had more people hanging in with the Loyalists in the eastern part of New Jersey, and more people wanting to get away from the British control in the West Jersey. But certainly both areas had both. But that's about it. I got to give it quick there.
Yeah. So I have a question here from Robert Wong in our audience, who is a regular. I think we probably all know Robert. Can you comment on the British, this is for Todd, can you comment on the British foraging parts and skirmishes after 1778, since they still occupied New York City through the end of the war? Clinton went on to capture Charleston in 1780. Were there large foraging parties in 1780?
Not in New Jersey. The British never really foraged in New Jersey again. The last big British forage was in 1782. That was in Westchester. Bergen County was heavily foraged by Washington in 79, and to a much greater extent in 1780. Washington, well, like any good military commander, studies his enemy and learns. Sir Henry foraged Bergen County in 77 and 78, and Washington saw that and says, wow, why don't we beat them to the punch next time? So he sent some troops into forage in 79, but mostly just before this time in 1780, when Washington had 14,000 troops in Bergen County, devouring it like locusts. The army was starving at the time. So that was really the last great forage, a little American foraging in 1781 in Bergen County, but that's about it. Washington also sent some troops into Essex County while the army was in Bergen in 1780 to get additional supplies there, because the different states were just not sending enough food. They talk about literally eating, the food would come in the morning and it would be eaten that afternoon. There were no stocks. They'd have bread one day, they'd have beef another day, but they couldn't get beef and bread on the same day. And also from different diaries and whatnot, it seems like the apple trees were pretty picked clean by the time the army left Bergen County.
Thank you. That's terrific. We have a great question here from Rita McClellan, which I'd like to adjust a little bit in her asking. Rita asks about the important women, both Loyalists and Patriots, living in Princeton during the occupational period, and what impact did they have during this period. I'd like to expand that just a little bit, rather than just Princeton. And Larry, we'll let you answer second, so you can answer Rita's question. But Todd, I'd be interested in knowing, up in the northern section of New Jersey, or even in and around New York and Westchester County, what was were there important women who took part in any of the actions of 1778 in the foraging?
Oh, what a wonderful question, because it leads just so perfectly in. I have a whole chapter in the Grand Forage book on one such woman. And in fact, the chapter of the book is called The Woman, it's because that is how they refer to her. It's actually a Philadelphia school teacher, a woman by the name of Ann Bates, who was married to somebody serving in the Royal Artillery's civil branch. And she ended up in New York City along with Sir Henry's army. And she's no longer teaching school, at least not to students. She's a spy, and one of the most successful British spies of the American Revolution. In fact, I'm going to eliminate the British part of it. One of the most successful spies of the American Revolution. She is caught at least once, but wiggles her way out of it. She provides incredibly detailed information to the British in New York City. And you're going to ask, how do you know this? How do we know? Spies generally operate in secrecy, and you're absolutely correct. There's a British intelligence book from 1778 that referred to her as the woman. They don't give her a name. Well, why don't they give her a name? Because if that book is captured, and then she's captured, she's going to be hanged. But I found in England a document from right after the war, putting in for the services that she details, exactly correlating with that British intelligence book. So we know, bam, Ann Bates, this woman, doing all this wonderful intelligence gathering right in the middle of Washington's army, right in the camp, tells the British exactly where Washington is, how many guys he has outside of his door, the whole 9 yards. So Ann Bates, you don't hear that much about her, but that's yet one more reason to buy the Grand Forage book.
That's great. That's a great story. So Larry, I'm going to turn this over to you, and if you could give us some insight into the role that women played during the Revolutionary period in Princeton.
Sure. No, again, I love the question. I'm so glad it came up. Women played tremendous roles, both in just taking care of their families when their husbands were involved in other activities, but also aiding their husbands in those activities. I talk about the Princeton being a supply depot, or raising supplies and that sort of thing. There's all kind of records of women who did sewing, did weaving, did all kind of different things of materials that were then sold locally and then got to the Continental Army. At one point, I believe it was about 1780, there was a group of women in New Jersey who got together and tried to get actually money for the Continental Army. It was organized by several women in Trenton, as well as several women in Princeton and a few others in other parts of the state. Washington actually didn't want money for the troops because he said all they're going to do is gamble it away, and they're going to get in trouble and get in fights with each other and that sort of thing. He says what they really need are shirts and socks, and anything that you ladies can do to do that would be much more helpful to them than money. And so that's one thing that came up. Also, noting that in all the things that happened in Princeton, with the Princeton buildings being used as hospitals, a number of women got involved with that, with caring for the wounded and sick. Many of the soldiers in the hospital were sick, not wounded. And that was something that women participated in. It's even after the Battle of Princeton, burying the dead. There's examples that are mentioned in the book about that. So I think it's important to recognize that there are two situations in Princeton. One, when the British were occupying it and a lot of the men were away, and the women had to not only keep things going, but they had to put up with the British and deal with the British efforts to invade their homes to use as billeting for their troops and for officers and that sort of thing. And you know, it just really disrupted their life, and their husband isn't there to help them. So it was not an easy thing to do. At the times when the British weren't there, there were still so many things that women were called on to do outside of the regular activities of caring for their families.
Thanks. Great question. We only have a few minutes left, and I don't think we're going to get to the rest of the questions. We have some wonderful questions from Jay Hershey and Jeff Lightburn and a few others, and I will tell you members of the audience who sent in questions that we couldn't get to, I will send those questions, the appropriate ones, to Larry and to Todd, so that you can get some answers from for your questions. I have one little quiz, and this will be something to leave you with when you go to, well, when we can have cocktail parties again. I'll give you a trivia question that you can throw out at your next party. Todd referenced a couple of colonies that we don't normally hear about, and this is one of my favorite trivia questions. We all know about the 13 colonies of North America during the Revolution. There were actually 17 colonies, and I'm going to ask you all if you know about the 17 colonies of the American Revolution. So if you, when you go to your next cocktail party, you can stump people with that one. So you're going to have to look that one up so you can see what the 17 colonies were of the American Revolution. I'll throw that to one of our guests. Can Todd or Larry or Jill, you want to raise your hand and tell me who can name the 17 colonies?
Actually, I got 19.
Okay. Oh, well, tell me the 19.
Well, you got 13, which I'll stipulate that people know. We got East and West Florida. We have Quebec. We have Nova Scotia. We have the island of St. John's, which you know today as Prince Edward Island. And you have Newfoundland. And that's not even taking into account places like Bermuda and Jamaica and the West Indies, or Central America, Bluefields, and the British Honduras.
Well, so you got me too, because I was just thinking about Quebec and Nova Scotia. I didn't think about St. John's and Newfoundland. That's it. But it's interesting to think about that, and you know, why did only the 13 on this you know, on this side of the world revolt? So we're going to have to leave it there. I want to do a nod to Jill Berry and Morven Museum and Gardens, and I sent you all the URL for Morven Museum and Gardens at morven.org. I want to thank Larry Kidder for his presentation on New Jersey during the Revolution, and also to Todd Braystead for his presentation. I have links. You can get in touch with either Todd or Larry or Jill, either at their websites or through me. You can always email me. And next week, we have on Author History Talks, I have coming to talk with us Glenn Williams, who will talk about Lexington and Concord, and Mark Anderson, who will talk about the 14th colony, Quebec, and the Quebec campaign. So with that, I would like to thank certainly our audience for coming. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter. And I hope to see you again on Author History Talks. And I wish you all health and a very good evening. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Roger.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.